More than 1/10 of global trade passes through a strait that measures just 20 miles across. The Bab el-Mandeb, at the southern entrance to the Red Sea, is a vital choke point on one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. But it passes through the heart of a dangerous region beset by civil wars and humanitarian crises. Great Decisions examines a region where the world's great powers can cooperate to create stability or allow deepening rifts to tear it apart. Red Sea Rivalries, a conflict of interests. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
The civil war in Yemen has become one of the defining conflicts of the early 21st century. 3 million people have been forced to flee their homes, and 15 million are on the brink of starvation. But peace proves elusive.
Yemen has gone through several versions of hell over the last several years. I mean, there's the major war that's taking place between the Houthi rebel movement and the internationally recognized government, which is backed by Saudi Arabia, by the United Arab Emirates, by others, by the US as part of the broader coalition, whereas the Houthis are backed by Iran and very few others.
Yemen is the world's largest humanitarian tragedy today. It's actually as much of a crime as a tragedy. 24 million or so of Yemen's 28 million citizens are dependent on international humanitarian aid to survive.
It may be Saudi planes that are dropping the bombs, but they are U.S. bombs. It is U.S. assistance that provides the targeting.
The Yemeni crisis has proven so intractable because foreign interventions have exacerbated the conflict.
The academic literature is quite clear. Most civil wars usually don't last longer than a year, partly because the parties run out of ammunition. But when outside forces step in and side with or support various sides in the conflict, that is one thing that causes these conflicts to keep on moving forward.
The United States has been selling weapons to the Gulf states for 70 years. They've never used them. Now, all of a sudden, they went and started using them without us being in the lead. And so now we, as Americans, are facing a series of dilemmas about what that means when they perhaps use the weapons in ways that we wouldn't.
It's gone on way too long without any party really being able to demonstrate that they could get a leg up. And it needs to be resolved. It really does. And we've been pressing everyone to sit down and get to the table and try to get a resolution that gets us to a substantially better place than where we are.
Yemen could be solved if the United States chose to solve it. The United States has essentially stood on the diplomatic sidelines.
Gradually, the war in Yemen has consumed the entire region around it. Somalia, Eritrea, and Djibouti have each offered their airspace to the Saudi-led coalition, and several African countries have sent troops to join the fighting.
The Saudis obviously didn't want to send too many of their own soldiers to fight and die in Yemen, so they recruited others, and the Sudanese in particular have served as cannon fodder.
One of the major challenges for the Emiratis in Yemen is that they don't share a border with Yemen. So they had to develop facilities in the region that could serve as a sort of logistical hub. So enter Eritrea.
As the war continues, experts worry that a failed state in Yemen could destabilize the entire Red Sea region, with ramifications that would echo around the globe.
This is not a place where you want to see greater chaos than exists today.
The root of all of this is that the United States has not decided whether it wants to be the military hegemon of the region or not and set up an order, a geopolitical order. I personally don't think it has the capacity to do so. I also don't think that it actually lies in the U.S. interest to do so.
The world's maritime powers regarded the Red Sea as a relative backwater until 1869. That year, a team of French engineers and Egyptian laborers completed a decade-long project to dig a canal across the Isthmus of Suez. Suddenly, the Red Sea was part of the route connecting Europe and Asia.
An artificial waterway that was built for the trades and pleasures of peacetime has turned Port Said into one of the most important of the world's junctions.
The Red Sea was a dead end until the Suez Canal shortened the arrival and departure of goods to Europe and between Europe and Asia dramatically.
For the British, the Red Sea was the entry point to the Indian Ocean. And the Indian Ocean is sort of the great lake that ties together most of Eurasia. And so if you're looking to control or regulate the entry and access points of the Indian Ocean, which could be relevant in any future conflict scenario, the Red Sea simply matters.
This is the activity in Suez itself. How many million tons of war material are handled here, no one could ever guess. Food, munitions, the myriad needs of a great new nation from overseas, and everyone in uniform. Victory was possible because there was no blundering at the crossroads of the world.
Today, the shipping lanes through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea remain critical for global commerce.
It's a real crossroads. There's a tremendous amount of commerce that passes through there. There's a tremendous diversity of nations that use the area for a commercial passage.
This is one of the most vital trade routes globally, and about 2/3 of the trade between China and Europe passes through the Red Sea.
It's certainly very much a linchpin between emerging Asia, the resource-based economies of the Middle East and demographic potential of Africa with advanced economies in the European Union, Mediterranean.
The Red Sea corridor is as important in many ways than the Persian Gulf is in terms of the transport of oil. It goes through the Bab el-Mandeb at the bottom of the Horn of Africa, up through the Suez Canal, and then into the Mediterranean.
The world's navies also rely on safe passage through the Red Sea to reach the warm waters of the Indian Ocean.
The concern for the security of the Indian Ocean is broadly shared. Many navies keep ships present. For what purpose? To help assure freedom of navigation.
But it also is an important control point when we think about where there might be conflict in a next great war, particularly a conflict with China. This would be a very, very strategic point and really important for the U.S. in particular to have some presence.
Some analysts predict that the countries along the Red Sea are poised for an economic boom. Foreign investment, especially in real estate, is on the rise.
The Horn of Africa is a rapidly economically growing area. It is, in many ways, it's complementary to the Gulf. It has manpower and land, both of which the Gulf countries lack. The Gulf countries have monetary, financial resources, so there's a complementarity. And in some ways, you could think of it as moving in unison in a good direction where all benefit.
So there's huge potential, economic potential, but this is a part of the continent that is going to have to achieve a certain level of political stability to actually realize those economic benefits.
Where I see some concern from some of the large institutional investors is with regard to land rights. And if investors aren't clear on land rights, this still remains a lingering concern and often will prohibit larger pools of capital from identifying East Africa or the Horn of Africa as a destination for investment.
The entire region is at the center of the key shipping lanes of the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, and the Straits of Hormuz. The potential of this region has never, ever been greater. 65% of its population is under the age of 30. Like all young men and women, they seek great futures to build, great national projects to join, and a place for their families to call home. But this untapped potential, this tremendous cause of optimism, is held at bay by bloodshed and terror.
The looming threat of terrorism, piracy, and war means that freedom of navigation in the region is never certain.
The piracy issues have abated quite a bit. There's occasional problems, but as a major international crisis like it was, a decade ago, no, it's not like that anymore. But the primary security concern now is the Houthi group in Yemen. If they're able to get a foothold again on the Red Sea coast, they're able to send missiles into the Red Sea, and that can affect shipping.
The narrowest choke point between Yemen and the Horn of Africa's tip is just 17 kilometers. So were you to sink a massive oil tanker in that choke point called the Bab el-Mandeb, you could precipitate a fairly significant security and trade crisis.
The richest and most powerful country on the Red Sea is Saudi Arabia. The holy city of Mecca, just inland from the coast, has long been a center for pilgrimage and commerce. In recent years, Riyadh has pursued an aggressive foreign policy. With tacit support from the United States, the Saudis have led the foreign intervention in Yemen.
Yemen is critical to Saudi Arabia because it is on its border. It's like Mexico to the United States. It's one of those countries that's always been a bit unstable, and that's always made the Saudis a bit uncomfortable.
The Saudis, with a broader coalition and with U.S. Logistical and military support under the Obama administration, intervened. And that intervention has now gone on for several years. And the goal has been to dislodge the Houthis, weaken them, defeat them in some sense. And that has proven to be an unattainable goal.
I was skeptical about it at the time because I was no fan of the Saudis and their new leadership. I understood why there's a theory that, okay, by being a part of this, we could help restrain it, help try to direct it towards diplomacy, but clearly that didn't work.
Some observers charge that the Saudis have taken necessary steps to combat Iran. Others contend that it is the Saudis who are the aggressors.
Let me make it clear, the Houthis have been the principal entity that has caused the misery in Yemen. They attacked Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia needed to defend themselves. I accept that. But the way that the Saudis responded to the threat made the circumstances worse, and a lot of innocent people have been hurt and killed as a result of those activities. So the Saudis are accountable for the failure to conduct the campaign the way it should have been.
It's quite clear that the Iranians have played some role. It's disputed the degree of control that they exercise over the Houthis, but certainly they're providing armaments.
Yemen is not the only country where regional rivalries are being played out. In Somalia, too, competing Middle Eastern governments have taken opposing sides in a domestic conflict.
Given that the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Qataris have an interest in East Africa, that rivalry is playing out in East African states, particularly in Somalia.
You've seen the Qataris and the Turks grow ever closer to the federal government in Mogadishu, while at the same time the Emiratis and the Saudis are working with some of the federal member state governments within Somalia. And that has undermined to some extent the state cohesion of Somalia.
Many of the countries in the Horn of Africa have been drawn into not just the Iran-Saudi, but also the Saudi-Qatari and UAE struggles.
Determined to secure their western shore, the Saudis have pieced together a coalition of like-minded neighbors to take part in joint naval exercises called the Red Wave.
It was the start of a plan to try to get all of the countries of the Red Sea to work together. There's a perception in the Gulf that the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East, and not just under the Trump administration, but the Obama administration. And so countries like the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia have started to focus on protecting their own western flank.
The Red Wave, I think, is totally consistent with the Saudi Emirati strategy in the Horn of Africa region, and that is to politically, diplomatically, militarily, and perhaps even economically bind countries of the Horn to the Saudi and Emirati political project, and particularly their political project being limiting the influence of Turkey, Qatar, and Iran.
In an attempt to secure the Red Sea, richer Arab countries have also sought military bases on the African side, a trend that has the potential to upend the balance of power in the region.
that whole coast has been a scramble for military bases, for political influence, for economic influence. So there's a military side to it. We're speaking about the role that military bases could play vis-a-vis Yemen, but there's also it's a more broader military scramble. China's involved as well. The U.S. is involved as well.
Djibouti is a site of a whole slew of international military facilities or foreign military bases. The United States, the Chinese, the French, the Japanese, the Saudis quite possibly going forward.
Some analysts worry that Arab countries are exporting their rivalries to the Horn of Africa, a part of the world with plenty of long-standing rivalries of its own.
You have a couple of splits, maybe three splits. On the one hand, you have the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, some of their allies, I would put Bahrain in that category, who are pushing in one direction in the Horn, which essentially means pushing against anyone affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. You have another group, Qatar, Turkey particularly, that have somewhat better relations with the Muslim Brotherhood and are going in another direction. And then Iran gets in the middle of all of this.
It used to be that the United States government thought about Africa as one portfolio and the Middle East and the Gulf as another portfolio. But now those two things are colliding.
Many countries in the Red Sea region are under the thumb of authoritarian regimes that are profoundly unpopular at home.
You have governments on both sides of the Red Sea that are quite authoritarian. And from a Western perspective, that does not strike me as being the proper way to be going with governance.
And there are real questions about the future of these countries going forward because there aren't real political institutions. Everything hinges on a single political figure, a strongman, effectively.
In Sudan's capital city of Khartoum, hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets in the spring of 2019 to demand democratic reforms. They succeeded in toppling longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir, but Sudan's military is unwilling to relinquish control.
The question of democracy in Sudan in many ways still hangs in the balance because the security apparatus that has unseated al-Bashir effectively is really al-Bashir's own government, right? It's still the old regime. They're very keen on retaining their political privileges and their dominance within the political system.
The role of several of the Gulf states is particularly important because they're effectively funding the Transitional Military Council in Sudan. So they have a disproportionate role in influencing what happens in the country. And unfortunately, money talks.
The Middle Eastern states, I think, their interests and how those interests are expressed in the Horn of Africa more or less fall into kind of two baskets. The one is an outstanding question about the role of Islam in political life. The second basket is really commercial and economic interests.
There is this sense that of a kind of domino effect that if too many countries experience democratic transitions, other people closer to home might get ideas. So from a Saudi perspective, it's always better to nip these things in the bud.
In neighboring Ethiopia, a diverse country of more than 100 million, ethnic tensions have threatened the central government.
The protests incited political jostling within the ruling coalition, and you saw a rebalancing power within the ruling coalition and the emergence of a new prime minister by the name of Abiy Ahmed. And Abiy Ahmed has taken on a reformist posture, and he's tried to do away with the old sort of authoritarian governing style of Ethiopia's ruling party.
He has opened up the press. He's opened up freedom for dissenting political groups. That is all for the good, but the ethnic pot is sort of boiling over, if you will. The lid was on the pressure cooker before, but that lid has been taken off, and now it's all spilling out.
With so much at stake, it is little wonder that many countries, including the United States, have established a military presence in the Red Sea. Recently, some officials in the Trump administration have suggested that the U.S. should commit even more assets to the region.
These states are undergoing historic transitions of a significant magnitude, and they deserve that kind of level of attention.
And the question is, will the United States apply or use the necessary political capital towards reining these countries in the Horn of Africa? And I think the answer to that thus far is either no or kind of mixed.
What we are doing in the Middle East right now is contributing to instability. We are not using our diplomatic or even our non-diplomatic means in order to be able to bring about a new stable order in the region. Instead, we have taken sides, and we have very much decided that the Saudi and the Israeli and the UAE line is correct.
China, too, has entered the fray. In 2017, the People's Liberation Army opened its first overseas base in Djibouti, just a few miles from American, French, and Japanese bases. The move has raised questions about Beijing's military ambitions.
The Red Sea has been important for just about any country over the last 300-400 years that has aspired to influence in the Indian Ocean, and China is certainly no exception. So China's, of course, put its first overseas military base in Djibouti, despite promising for many decades that it would never do anything of the kind.
It is a milestone for the Chinese because before Djibouti, China never had a formal military base. Although they don't call it a military base, they call it Naval Supply Support Facility. And in my conversation with PLA officers, they also have made it clear that U.S. should not be too worried about the Djibouti base because it is only the first of many to come.
It's important to remember that the history is that we wanted China to participate in these counter-piracy missions, and now that they are going ahead and proceeding with sort of outfitting their logistics base there, people are suspicious. Maybe they want to use it for something more.
As China promotes its Belt and Road Initiative, experts disagree on how overt a role Beijing intends to play in the politics of the Red Sea region.
The U.S. doesn't depend that much on trade, on commerce going through the Red Sea. China does. China, about 40% of China's trade goes through the Red Sea. That's a critical element for China.
If you look at a map of the One Belt, One Road Initiative, it's give or take a circle that goes over land and water around the world. And it's meant to be the future of trade. It's meant to be this efficient circle of world trade where they're building the train tracks and the ports that are necessary to have a more efficient set of trade routes. And so that One Belt, One Road goes up the Red Sea.
There's been a change in the color of the Chinese foreign policy under the new leadership of Xi Jinping, and people are wondering how far that's going to go, and I think has raised a lot of questions about this so-called peaceful rise policy.
Some analysts worry that the U.S. has not engaged enough politically and economically around the Red Sea to offer an effective counter to China's growing presence.
One of the things I've heard when I'm in Africa is that the U.S. likes to complain about the Chinese, but they don't like to compete.
It is fully within the capability of the United States to compete, and where China breaks the rules, to confront. But to say we should oppose Chinese commercial and investment activity, or somehow it's a threat to us and we can't compete with it, strikes me as profoundly un-American.
Those of us that sit on the Intelligence Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee, and my colleagues up here that sit on other committees, are well aware of how quickly China is moving. And it isn't just the growth, it's the velocity of the growth of what they're doing.
The Trump administration certainly has a rhetorical acknowledgement of China's ideological challenge, but what you really need is a long-term diplomacy, building partnerships, the kind of more soft power elements of what we do, and that hasn't necessarily been a strong suit of the Trump administration.
The risk for American diplomacy in the Horn, or how the United States would get it wrong, is to make its interactions with the Horn not about democratization, economic development, but in fact entirely about containing China. I think that's entirely the wrong approach.
The Red Sea could be an area where American and Chinese interests align, presenting a valuable opportunity for cooperation.
I mean, it has in the past. I think most people in the U.S. counter-piracy efforts were quite pleased at China's contributions there.
There is this kind of hysteria in some ways of the rise of China and the growing prominence of China in the Horn of Africa. And they are there, and they're there in important ways, but mostly as providers of finance.
It's not inherently a competitive environment between the United States and China, despite some of the rhetoric out of Washington and in Beijing. But, how do we find out, how do we identify what some of the areas of mutual interest, in fact, are, and how to pursue those openings in a way that's constructive and hopefully benefits not just external powers and broader questions of international peace and security, but also the people of the region.
Efforts to bring peace to the Red Sea region will test whether the international community can work together toward a common good. The stakes are high. The wrong decisions could create a fractured region of failed states and dangerous seas.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet in community centers, libraries,
Okay, welcome back. I will turn it over to Dr. Gibbs to share her screen and start the discussion.
Okay, here goes. Let's see if my technology know-how can share a screen.
Do you have sound in your PowerPoint?
No, just me talking.
Perfect.
All right.
Looks great.
You're seeing it?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I should start out with a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm not a Red Sea expert by any means. I do teach the Modern Middle East class in the history department at Hope. And I have sort of a voyeur's interest in what goes on in the Middle East. I pay attention, but I'm not a Middle East scholar by training. And my first reaction when HASP asked me to talk about the Red Sea was, oh, good, HASP. I really like HASP. My second reaction was, the Red Sea, that sounds interesting. And then I started thinking about it. And when I was thinking about it, whoopsie, hang on. Let's see. There's my forward. Whoopsie. There's my reaction. What a mess. It's really complicated. And I think the video did a good job of laying out some of the complications. And if I were going to talk about all of them, we would be here for hours and hours. And I know that's not the plan. So I thought maybe we should take a look at a map. I really like maps. They mentioned a lot of countries in the video. And I thought maybe we should take a look. I want to start in the left-hand, upper left-hand of the map and look at the states that border the Red Sea. We start in the upper left with Egypt and Sudan and Eritrea, which has a long coastline, and the independence of Eritrea about 30 years ago made Ethiopia, which previously controlled the area, a landlocked country. So Eritrea, a relatively new state. Djibouti, that's where the movie talked about all the competing military bases. Somalia, then crossing the Gulf of Aden, we get to Yemen on the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, and then right under where the white label says Gulf of Aqaba, the little horn on the right-hand side of the top of the Red Sea, that's Jordan under there. And Israel also has a teeny tiny port at the southern tip of the Negev Desert. So those are the states that border the Red Sea. And then there are the regional powers, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Iran, Kuwait, Iraq, Ethiopia, Syria, and I suppose, when I was listening to the movie, I said, I suppose I should have put Turkey on there. They're a regional power too. And of course, the one that's not anywhere near this on the map, China. And all of those are going to be players in what's going on in the Middle East and affecting the Red Sea. But I'm certainly not going to talk about all of them. No way am I going to talk about all of them. You may breathe a sigh of relief now. Instead of that, I'd like to talk about 4 topics over the next, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30. I'd like to talk a little bit about oil, a little bit about Yemen. The movie was good on Yemen, I thought, but maybe a little bit incomplete. I'd like to talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then the most recent thing that's happened, the normalization of relations deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. I did see there was a question in the chat about when the movie was made and what has changed since then. I looked quickly and I couldn't find a copyright date on the movie, but it was posted to the Foreign Policy Association's YouTube channel in March of 2020. And so my guess is that it was made in sort of sometime in 2019. And since then, there has been a significant diplomatic advance in the relationship between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. They've made a deal to normalize relations. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that at the end. So that's where we're going in that order: oil and Yemen and Saudi Arabia and Iran and the Israel and the United Arab Emirates deal. And when I was getting this together, these 4 things were more closely related than I thought they were. So I initially had a 5th. I initially wanted to talk about unstable states in the Red Sea region, but I ended up taking that out because it was just too much, because there's a lot. And these 4 fit together better, but unstable states also a problem. So 4 things, and we're going to start with oil. And I want to suggest that you not panic too much about the number of slides that I'm going to show you about oil. I don't have that many slides about all 4 things, so you won't be here forever. Let's see, here we go. We're going to start with oil. And what I'd like to talk about to start are the Red Sea oil pipelines. Right? On this map, the red lines are significant oil pipelines in the Red Sea area. There's the Saudi East-West pipeline that runs from the oil fields in the Eastern Province to the oil depot on the Red Sea. So Saudi Arabia can do cross-peninsular oil transport. That turns out to be important for Saudi Arabia because the Eastern Province is on the Persian Gulf. And the Persian Gulf is subject to disruption by Iran. And Iran and Saudi Arabia, not to put too fine a point on it, are not friends. So getting your oil out of Saudi Arabia without having to go through the Persian Gulf is of value to Saudi Arabia. So they want to be able to get that oil to the Red Sea where they control the shipping lanes. Up on the upper left, the Sumed pipeline, that's short for Suez Mediterranean. It goes from the port of Suez in Egypt up to Alexandria in the north. And it's an alternate way of moving oil. If you don't have a ship that you want to sail through the Suez Canal, you can send it through. You can send your oil through the pipeline, the Sumed pipeline. That could be an advantage in the case of a war that threatened the that threatened the passage of the Suez Canal. So it's a sort of a security guarantee for the transit of oil from the Middle East to the Mediterranean. The Sudan oil pipeline, it's an oil export pipeline. They do pump oil, or they do drill for oil in Sudan. And it's called the Great Nile Oil Pipeline. And here's something that I didn't know before this. It's operated by the China National Petroleum Corporation, which owns a 40% stake in the National Sudanese Oil Company. China helped build that pipeline in 1999. And so when the movie talked about Chinese investment in infrastructure in Africa, this is one of the things that China is interested in. So they're interested in Sudanese oil, and interested enough to invest in infrastructure and to, in fact, be part of the company that runs the pipeline that comes up from Sudan to Port Sudan on the Red Sea. Yeah, those are my big pipelines. And then you see the narrowest point. That's what they called the Bab el-Mandeb in the movie, the narrowest point, 18 miles wide, at the tip of the Arabian Peninsula, near the border of Eritrea and Djibouti. So Red Sea oil pipelines. Oil is a significant factor in the region. It also travels through the Red Sea on tankers and goes through the Suez Canal to get from the Middle East into the Mediterranean. So oil is a very important commodity, and other commodities too, of course, shipped through the Red Sea via the Suez Canal. Right, moving on. There's another pipeline. This is another thing I learned. There's a Yemeni pipeline that runs, Yemen doesn't have very much oil. It's a poor country in part because its oil resources are much poorer than other places in the Gulf or in the Arabian Peninsula, but it does have oil. And it has a pipeline that runs from the interior to the Red Sea. And just off the coast, there is a grounded oil tanker, the Safer. It's called Safer, which is kind of ironic. It's not safe at all. It's an oil storage vessel. It's been there since 1988. The Yemenis were using it as an oil storage depot. And just currently, and when I say just currently, I mean, this is October 2020 article in The Economist, and you can find it some other places too. That oil storage vessel is leaking like a beast. And people are very worried about it. It holds a lot of oil, 4 times as much as the Exxon Valdez, the oil tanker that crashed in Alaska years ago. It is presenting a huge danger of an ecological disaster in the Red Sea if it continues to leak. It's currently controlled by the Houthi rebels in the Yemen civil war, who are not doing anything to maintain it. There's another danger that if it's hit by a missile from the Yemeni civil war, it could cause a blast on par with that big fertilizer blast in Beirut a couple of months ago. So it's sort of a lurking danger from the oil industry in Yemen. So far, so good. I don't see anything in the chat. Any questions? All right, I have one more pipeline to talk about. My last pipeline is the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline. It's an Israeli pipeline. I bet you didn't know they had one. And this Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline has a very interesting history. It was built in the 1960s as a cooperative effort between Israel and Iran. People may not remember that Israel, before the Iranian Revolution of '79, had a very good relationship with Iran. There was trade between them. They did military deals together for weapons, and they shipped Iranian oil up through Eilat to Ashkelon on the Mediterranean. And even after the Iranian Revolution, when Iran was subject to international sanctions, the Israelis cooperated with the Iranian revolutionary government for a while in busting sanctions by shipping Iranian oil to the Mediterranean through the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline. Subsequently, the relationship between Iran and Israel soured, and Israel nationalized the Iranian part of the pipeline, giving the Iranians one more thing to be irritated about. But recently, this pipeline has become part of a deal between the United Arab Emirates and Israel to bring oil to the Mediterranean. The company that is running it now is the Europe-Asia Pipeline Company, and it's jointly owned by the Israeli government and a company out of the United Arab Emirates called the Med-Red Land Bridge, so Mediterranean Red Sea Land Bridge. So there's money afoot. There's money afoot and oil afloat between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. I told you these four things were going to overlap. So that's my last pipeline picture. If we look at some of the players, Egypt, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, China, Yemen, both the government and the Houthi rebels in Yemen, Israel, the UAE, not to mention anybody who ships anything through the Suez Canal. The Red Sea is a matter of enormous international interest, really an international hot zone for trade. Although I realize that hot zone usually means epidemics now, and that's not what I meant. So that's my brief introduction to the tangled politics of oil in the Red Sea region. Second thing that I'd like to talk about, again briefly, is the war in Yemen. The civil war in Yemen has been a conflict that's been on and off in the whole of the last 20 years, with really out and out war for the last 6. In the first instance, this is a civil war between Houthi rebels and the majority Yemeni government, the internationally recognized Yemeni government. There's a religious difference and an ethnic difference between the Houthis, the rebels, and the majority population of Yemen. The Houthis are religiously, they're Zaydi. It's a Shiite sect. It's a small Shiite sect. They're a different kind of Shiites than the ones in Iran. They recognize a different line of descent from the Prophet Muhammad. And the majority of the population and the recognized government in Yemen are Sunni Muslims. And over the last 20 years, the Yemeni government has been running a process of, let's call it Sunniization, the idea that really it should be a Sunni state and we shouldn't have to worry about the Zaydi minority that was in the north near the Saudi Arabian border. And there was lots of pressure to disadvantage the Zaydis, the Houthis, and to make them conform to Saudi norms. And this caused conflict, right? The Houthis didn't want to conform to Yemeni Sunni norms. And that started off the conflict. And that waxed and waned in the first part of the 2000s. There was an Arab Spring uprising in Yemen in 2011 that resulted in a transition of the Yemeni government, but it really didn't produce any kind of democracy in Yemen. And there's still a internationally recognized Sunni government in Yemen that is resisted by the Houthi rebels. The movie said, and I thought this was quite wise, civil wars don't last that long. Usually they don't last 6 years unless somebody else is stirring the pot. And there are many spoons in this particular pot. The Yemeni government is supported by Saudi Arabia, by the United Arab Emirates, and indirectly by the United States, and to some extent directly. I mean, we're not sending troops, but we're sure sending arms. And we're also selling arms to Saudi Arabia, which are then being used in the Yemen war. So the United States is, I think one of the last guys in the movie said the United States is taking sides in the conflicts in the Red Sea region. And that's true. It's not clear how much of an honest broker the United States can be, because we definitely have our fingers in the Yemeni civil war. The Houthis, on the other hand, are supported by Iran as fellow Shiites and also the enemy of Saudi Arabia on the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Eritrea is supporting the Houthi rebels. And there's some hint that North Korea might be selling them arms. I don't know that North Korea really has a dog in this fight other than the ability to make money by selling arms. That is enough for some people. The Yemeni civil war is made worse by the fact that other nations are pursuing other agendas through fighting in Yemen. And although about a year and a half ago, it looked like things might be moving toward a solution, that did not work out, and things are as bad now as they have ever been in Yemen. Things are very, very bad and unstable. This has produced one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. There's famine. There's cholera, which is a disease that's spread by dirty water. There's COVID-19. There are millions of internally displaced people. In 2017, the United Nations declared Yemen to be the world's worst humanitarian disaster. And something like 80% of the population is dependent on humanitarian aid. The movie talked a little bit about that. And I have some figures on that from the United States Director of National Intelligence report in 2019. This is the humanitarian disaster of Yemen. A population of almost 30 million people estimated. They haven't been concerned with taking census recently. Just more than 22 million are in need of humanitarian assistance. 16 million lack access to clean drinking water and sanitation. Almost 16 million are food insecure, with another 5 million just short of famine. 1.26 million suspected cholera cases, and 2,700 cases of diphtheria. That's a disease we don't talk much about in the United States anymore, although my grandmother had it. And 2.8 million internally displaced persons, right? We don't call them refugees if they don't cross an international border. They're internally displaced persons. And this is a 2019 graphic, and so it does not include COVID cases. I don't have numbers on COVID cases in Yemen, but it's the epidemic is bad there too, because there's almost no opportunity to engage in social distancing or mitigation or quarantine. It's just a bad situation for public health. So Yemen will continue to be a source of insecurity in the region, right there at the mouth of the Red Sea, unless there is diplomatic will to solve this. Now, one of the senators in the movie said that the United States could make this war stop if it wanted to, but has shown no signs of wanting to. And I thought about that for a while, and it seems to me that if the United States wanted to stop the war in Yemen, its only option really is to lean on Saudi Arabia, because our current relationship with Iran is so awful that we have no leverage. The only one of the combatant parties that we have leverage with is Saudi Arabia. And so if the United States wanted to push for peace in Yemen, it would involve pushing Saudi Arabia. And that's something that the current administration, at least, has shown no appetite for doing. So the Yemeni war in many ways is a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are contending for regional supremacy. They want to be the great power, each of them in the Middle East. And they're contending for power and prestige in the Islamic world. Each of them wants to be the premier Islamic state. And so they're competitors in the region. I mentioned at the very beginning that these things were going to overlap: the oil, the war in Yemen, the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are contending for dominance in the Middle East. I don't know how much more I have to say about that. Remember that Saudi Arabia is a Sunni state. It has a Shiite minority that it is currently engaged in persecuting fairly severely. In the last year, it executed a couple of dozen Shiite clerics, Shiite mullahs, and the Shiite population of Saudi Arabia, a small minority, is pretty oppressed. The Saudi government clings or holds on to the prestige of being the guardian of the holy places, the city of Mecca and the city of Medina, the places where the Prophet lived, the places that are the home of the annual pilgrimage, the Hajj every year. Was canceled this year for the first time since the 19th century because of COVID, but generally there's a big international pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia by Muslims who want to visit the holy places. And Saudi Arabia gains enormous prestige from being the custodian of the holy places. The Islamic Republic of Iran is the world's most prominent Shiite power. They also consider themselves to be the dominant Muslim state in the Middle East, and they are at odds often with Saudi Arabia. Both are significant oil powers, and both are threatened by the collapse of the oil market this year. Remember that the oil market collapsed in the summer, produced partly by the spring and summer, I suppose I should say. The collapse in the oil market was produced partly by COVID, by the drop in demand for oil worldwide as factories closed and people stopped traveling. And so the price went down. OPEC, the oil cartel, tried to cut production in response to the fall of oil prices, and they were resisted by Russia, that didn't want to deal with a cut in oil prices or cut in oil production. And so the oil market collapsed as Saudi Arabia and OPEC were at a standoff with Russia, and nobody cut production in a situation where nobody was buying oil. And so there was a huge oil glut. The price got down to about $20 a barrel. This was awful for oil producing states whose national budgets depend on the revenue from oil. And this has another huge possibility for producing instability. If the Saudis can't support their citizens at the subsidized level the citizens are used to from oil revenue, there could be unrest in Saudi Arabia, and Iran has something of the same problem. Their budget is enormously dependent on oil revenues. If oil prices stay low, they are in bad trouble. I had occasion to look up the price of the average price of Middle Eastern oil last week. I was teaching a class at Hope, and it's back up to just over $40 a barrel, or at least it was last week. And so it's a little bit higher than it was at the worst of the oil glut, but Saudi Arabia really needs the oil price to be around $80 a barrel to make its budget work. And so Saudi is still in quite a bit of trouble. I don't know what Iran needs the budget or needs the price of oil to be to make its budget work, but they're in a similarly difficult situation. So Iran and Saudi Arabia contesting for dominance in the Middle East and running proxy wars and worrying about oil prices and the oil trade that's common to them. Right, last thing, the normalization of the relationship between Israel and the United Arab Emirates this summer. This one caught me off guard. I was surprised, but when I started reading about it in preparation for this, I decided that it was my fault that I was surprised. I should have been paying attention. Remember the pipeline deal that I talked about at the very beginning? The Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline is a cooperative effort between the United Arab Emirates and the Israelis. And it turns out that the Gulf states, including the United Arab Emirates, have been doing economic deals with Israel quietly for years, even though they didn't have full diplomatic relations. They've been exchanging security information. They've been buying and selling things and cooperating in business ways for many, many years now. The Emiratis don't have a particularly visceral enmity toward Israel. They didn't lose any land when Israel was formed, at least not at the governmental level. They don't have an enmity. It's hard to tell what individual Emirati people think. The United Arab Emirates is an authoritarian state. They don't have a free press, and it's generally not a good idea to express disagreement with the government. So we don't know if ordinary Emiratis are pleased or displeased with this deal with Israel. But for the government, it's clearly a good thing. The Emiratis are tightly allied with Saudi Arabia, and so one can assume that this deal between the United Arab Emirates and Israel is agreeable to the Saudis. And you can look at this too as the building of a regional alliance in opposition to Iran. Look at where the United Arab Emirates is in relationship to Iran. If you're interested in the security of the Strait of Hormuz, that little strait where the United Arab Emirates points up into the Gulf of Gulf of Oman, then an alliance between the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia starts to make sense. It gives them a strategic position on the approaches to the Gulf of Oman and the Straits of Hormuz. Israel doesn't have any problem dealing with countries that are nominally its enemies. It dealt with Iran before the revolution. So dealing with the United Arab Emirates now is not significantly different than that. As they make a regional coalition, the Saudis and the Israelis and the United Arab Emirates, that is likely to be in opposition to Iran, you can ask what's lost in this deal. And basically what's lost in this deal is the interests of the Palestinians. The United Arab Emirates have made a deal with Israel without any regard for pressure to ease the occupation of the West Bank. The Israelis have announced that they're stopping their plans to annex the West Bank, and that is okay, nominally a good thing. Netanyahu had previously announced his intention to go ahead and formally annex the West Bank, but the planting of Israeli settlements in the West Bank without annexation is still going on. And the United States just announced within this last week that they're changing policies to allow American investment to occur in Israeli settlements in the West Bank and occupied territories. So the rights of the Palestinians are basically being sold down the river in this developing alliance between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. The Red Sea then is a nexus for a great deal of conflict and some unexpected cooperation. But the cooperation is not unrelated to the conflict. The Red Sea is a matter of regional interest and of world interest, and it's worth paying attention to. Even if it takes a little effort, the news is there, even if it's not in the headlines, even if we don't see it on the television news, you have to make a little bit of effort. But if you do that, you can follow what's going on in this region of the world and try to unpack what's behind the headlines, like the normalization of relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. It's money and it's geopolitical maneuvering in the tension between Saudi Arabia and other Arab states and Iran. I don't know that I have a clear lesson to draw from all this, besides the fact that it's complicated, going back to my very first slide, and the fact that it's significant on a world scale, and it is absolutely worth paying attention to. So that's my half hour. That's all I've got in terms of slides. But I am more than happy. Oh, and I have some resources. I can share this with HASP and make these resources available to you. They're not particularly scholarly resources. They're popular press. They're smart popular press, and they're mostly short. And I suppose that's a good thing. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm certainly happy to take questions.
You have a couple questions in the chat. Do you want me to go ahead and read you those first, and then go ahead and open it up for people to unmute themselves and just ask directly?
Yeah, I can see them, but if not everybody's reading the chat, maybe you can read them so everybody can hear them.
Absolutely. The first one says, when was the film produced and what has changed positively or negatively since then? And okay. I'm looking at this as being a 2020 edition since I have the tape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything that's not on the back of the box. So I had imagined that it was made in 2019 if the copyright is 2020.
That's correct, because we get an order form for it in like December and it arrives in like January. So it arrived in January 2020. So that has to mean it was recorded in 19.
Mm-hmm.
So can you identify anything that you think has materially changed positively or negatively since then?
You mean besides the UAE Israel deal that I already talked about?
Yeah. So that, and yeah,
I think I kind of did that one.
Okay. And I'm working on the side, just so you know. So you may have answered some of these. The video stated that a weakness of the U.S. approach to the Mideast Red Sea Gulf of Hormuz region has been the blanket acceptance and endorsement of Saudi and Israel views and priorities. Please help us understand this field of concerns. As both you and the video have described, China has gained and continues to gain both influence and control over the region's economics and politics by investing great resources in the infrastructural development of the region. It seems that the U.S. has hoped to compete with China for influence on the cheap without committing great resources and by relying on militaristic power. Here's the question. Is it important for the U.S. to compete for politics and economic influence in this region? If it is, how should the U.S. increase its influence? And again, if you've answered this in your lecture.
Yeah, no, I don't think I have. I think those are two good questions. I mean, certainly, one of the things that I did say is that the U.S. is not anymore perceived as an honest broker in the Middle East because of its fairly one-sided endorsement of Israel with respect to the Palestinians, right? We've cut off all aid to the Palestinian Authority, and the United States just hasn't been talking to the Palestinians. They closed their offices in the West Bank. And there's no discussion going on with the Palestinians. The United States has pretty much endorsed the Israeli position. It's moved the US embassy to Jerusalem in the face of general international opposition to that, right? The problem with Jerusalem is that both the Palestinians and the Israelis claim it as their capital. And for the most part, international embassies are in Tel Aviv, not in Jerusalem. The Trump administration moved the US embassy to Jerusalem, making the Israelis very happy and the Palestinians very annoyed. There's just not much bilateral goodwill or trilateral goodwill in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with respect to the United States right now. It's also true that the United States is pretty firmly in bed with Saudi Arabia under the Trump administration. Saudi Arabia was President Trump's first international trip after he became president. That was a matter of great prestige to the Saudis. Jared Kushner is buddies with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. One of the articles that I read preparing for this said that one of the ways that the United States helped broker the Israel UAE deal was that everybody in the United Arab Emirates and everybody in Saudi Arabia understands a man who sends his son-in-law to do an important job. So that meant in cultural terms in Saudi Arabia and in the United Arab Emirates that sending Jared Kushner as the envoy about the Middle East meant that they knew that this would get back to President Trump right away. And they knew that President Trump was serious. And because the Trump administration had tight relationships with the Emirates and with the Saudi government, it could do this personal diplomacy in a way that it just can't with the Palestinian Authority, where it doesn't have any personal relationship at all. So I do think that a weakness of the US, I'm looking at the question, a weakness of the United States approach to the Middle East, Red Sea, Gulf of Hormuz region has been the blanket acceptance and endorsement of the Saudi and Israeli views and priorities. And that includes pretty much unbending enmity toward Iran, which has been a change in American policy within the Trump administration. You can see that with getting out of the Iran nuclear deal that the president says is the worst deal ever. It just means that the United States has no leverage at all in discussions with Iran. So I do think that it's a weakness in American foreign policy to be so firmly linked with one side in any controversy where the United States hopes to have influence to make peace and make the region improve its problem. Is that okay? Other further questions? I'll do the China one too, but let's see if there's any further question about that. You can unmute yourself if you don't want to type.
While you're doing that, the last comment in the chat is, can we see the first map while we're talking? Would it be possible for you to pull that up?
Sure.
I don't know how easy it is for you to reshare your screen, but maybe it's salient to kind of people understanding it.
Yep. Hang on, coming back. Let's see. And I want to go back.
Yeah, perfect.
Someone's unmuted.
All right, that's what you wanted, yes? Okay, the downside is now I can't see the chat. So
okay, let me go ahead and, so the China, it seemed that the US had hoped to compete with China for influence on the cheap without committing great resources, and by relying on militaristic power. Is it important for the US to compete for politics and economic influence in the region? If it is, how should the US increase its influence?
Oh yeah, I completely agree with the premise that the United States is trying, at present, trying to increase its influence on the cheap. China is devoting enormous resources to building infrastructure all through the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America, and they're asking in return things like access to natural resources and positions for military bases or support structures, as they call the one in Djibouti. And one of the things that the Chinese really don't care about is human rights. One of the things that has in the past, although not currently, been a hallmark of American foreign policy, at least since the Carter administration, is linking US foreign aid to advances in human rights in other countries. And the Chinese just don't do that. They're not interested in other people's human rights records. So there are lots of governments around the world that are perfectly willing to do business with the Chinese to get their new rail systems or their new ports or their new infrastructure projects funded without having to answer inconvenient questions about what they do with dissidents. The United States at the same time really has in the last 4 years especially gutted the State Department. There are lots of places that don't even have ambassadors. We're not doing very well even at regular old diplomacy, at high level diplomacy, much less at soft diplomacy or foreign aid. I think we've in the last 4 years really harmed our position in the world by not using American soft power, by using the very, very small portion of the United States budget that's devoted to foreign aid to make America a welcome collaborator around the world, as opposed to just that power over there that might want something eventually, but isn't doing anything for us right now. Yeah, we're trying to be an influential power on the cheap, and it's not working. The other thing I think that we can do is devote ourselves more thoroughly to multilateral organizations. Again, that has been the pattern from World War II up until 2016. We're doing much less about keeping our multilateral relationships intact now, and I think that's a problem. The United States' position in the world is materially worse than it was 4 years ago.
Okay, let me go ahead and, if you feel more comfortable taking that slide down and looking at the chat, feel free, but I'll read you the next question. As oil prices continue to decline in the Middle East, which countries become more destabilized, and what overall impacts are likely to result?
Okay, well, first thing I'm going to say is historian here, not really good at predicting things. But certainly Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq are the big oil states. Sudan is a producer. The United Arab Emirates is a producer, although they've taken fairly significant steps to transition themselves into a financial services industry. They've done better at diversifying themselves than other Middle Eastern countries. The problem with states that depend on their oil revenue to maintain their budgets is that lots of them fund public services, public employees, sometimes just handing out money to citizens. Kuwait is like that, right? Kuwaitis don't work. Kuwaitis just get money from the government, from the oil revenues. And so if the states aren't making their oil money, they're going to have trouble maintaining the standard of public support for the citizens that the citizens are used to. And when that happens, you can get unrest. You can get domestic unrest if the population is not getting from the government what the government has been accustomed to provide. And I think that could be a problem in any of the states that rely on oil revenue for the maintenance of their domestic budget. Iraq's got a little bit of a separate problem. Their problem is largely that the oil is mostly in the north, in the Kurdistan region, and in the south, around Basra, that's mostly Shiites. The big provinces in the middle, where Baghdad is, that are controlled by the Sunni Muslims, not much oil there. So Iraq is gonna is subject to destabilization based on the uneven distribution of its resources through the country, and by the fact that the country itself is not particularly well unified. If the Kurdish area in the north, if Iraqi Kurdistan loses its oil money, well, that's bad, because that's what they depend on to allow themselves a semblance of independence. But they haven't been around long enough to have a really huge budget that's dependent on that oil wealth. So I think that internal unrest is the real danger in most of these countries that depend on oil to support their national budget. It's a problem for Russia too, by the way. I read one book. I wish I could tell you what it was. I don't remember where it was that I read this, that said if it helps, you can think of Russia as Saudi Arabia with permafrost. because one of their big international exports is oil.
Very good. You have another question in the chat. Kim Goddess, in parentheses, Black Wave Book, argues that the Saudi-Iran rivalry is fostering extremism in the region. Trump has sided with the Saudi version of an Islamic theocracy. If Biden wins, will he tilt toward a more even-handed relationship with Iran as well as the Saudis? Thank you.
I have not read Biden's position paper on this. My guess would be yes, based on previous policies of the Obama administration. But I actually don't know the answer to that question. My guess is yes. I think that a more even-handed approach would be consistent with Biden's foreign policy beliefs, but I haven't read Biden's position on that, so I can't give you a firm answer.
Okay, you had one affirmative comment in the chat, just thanking you for answering that long question, that multi-part question very thoroughly. Great presentation. I don't see anything else in the chat. Let me double check, make sure I haven't missed anything. So if people have additional questions, we have a few more minutes on this amazing topic. If you would like to unmute yourself and just ask verbally.
Is it okay if I stop sharing? I'd like to see faces if people are going to ask questions.
Absolutely. Okay. Don't be shy, ask people.
I have a question about the Chinese infrastructure building that's going on in Africa in return for access to natural resources. Somehow that does not seem like a very wise thing for the local people of a nation to be part of. It seems like if your natural resources are taken away and all you get is a train track that goes to a mine or a port that takes those natural resources out of your country, that doesn't seem like a very sustainable, wise way to keep your economy going.
You're right, it's probably not. I would argue that it's a short-term solution that's going to make different long-term problems, right? It helps short-term development. And sometimes in less developed countries, short-term development looks pretty good. The depletion of natural resources is a longer-term problem that people don't worry about in the immediate now, because the resources will buy something that the society needs now. And okay, so maybe it is the train that runs from the port to the mine, but maybe it also creates a public transportation system in the capital city. There can be things that are actually good for the society, but I agree with you that it's penny wise, pound foolish.
And you didn't mention, because it's not what this is about, but you didn't mention the various climate issues that happen in Africa, in the Horn of Africa, including the locusts and the droughts and the famines that go on there. Is our policy ever going to be important enough to address that?
Well, climate, right? Climate is a world system. You can't fix climate in just one place. Can I be really crude for a minute, right? You hear people say this about it. We don't have a peeing section in the pool.
Right.
Right. If we're going to take action to mitigate the human-driven effects of climate change, that needs to be a world effort, but it also needs to be individual countries' effort, because we don't make decisions as a world, right? We make decisions as individual countries. And so the United States has stepped back from a leadership role in climate change under the current administration, withdrawing from the Paris Accords, not trying to change the fuel efficiency standards for cars because it costs more, rolling back environmental protections. We've not been a model climate change country in the last 4 years, and we weren't a model before that either. We were just getting better. There are efforts worldwide to mitigate climate change, but just as this didn't happen all at once, it's not going to get better all at once. And so if we're talking, to go back to the earlier question about how the United States can be a good friend, besides mitigating the human effects, or the human-driven factors of climate change, one of the things we should be thinking about doing is how to mitigate the effect on people of existing climate disasters. And again, that's money, that's foresight, that's trying to figure out what you do about all those locusts, what you do about the advance of the Sahara to the south. And those are bigger questions, but if we don't start thinking about it now, and we're going to get caught flat-footed when a real disaster happens.
Thank you.
Looking at the moving of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, isn't it also just another example of the U.S. kind of poking the bear with the Arab communities because of the fact that Jerusalem isn't just the center of religion for the Jewish and the Christian faith, but also for the Muslim faith, and to basically turning it over as the capital of Israel. It seems like just one more irritation for the Muslim communities.
Oh, yes. I mean, it's Israeli. Your cat does the same thing my cat does, always wants to be in front of the camera. The position of Israel is that Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel. And the Palestinian position is that there needs to be a Palestinian state and Jerusalem will be its capital. And if you're going to be, even-handed about it, you could say, well, why can't it be both, right? Why can't it be both? Well, it can only be both if both sides agree that it can be both. And that's got to be a diplomatic negotiation. In all of the negotiations since 1967 about what's going to happen to the occupied territories, the problem of Jerusalem has always been the hard problem that they put off for later. And I would argue that the American move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem is destabilizing a persistent but stable problem by putting our thumb on the scales in favor of Israel. There has not been a rush of other countries to do that too. So I'm not sure that it's going to make a huge difference internationally. Not everybody else in the world is moving their embassies to Jerusalem, but I don't think it was a good idea.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Well, we're right about at the 2:30 mark. If anyone is feeling shy, speak up now, or we'll go ahead and thank Dr. Gibbs for an amazing presentation, thoughtful discussion. Yay!
Thank you. I always enjoy HASP. You are my people. I really enjoy it.
Thank you. That's a huge compliment. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah.
Stay safe, stay healthy, and don't forget to vote.
Yes. Happy end of election season.
Yes, yeah. Praise God.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you.